Hey students, this is Mr. Sharp again, here with the last video for Unit 5 as we continue our talk about reform movements in American History 1. So as we're wrapping up everything, we've already discussed Second Great Awakening, we've already discussed Transcendentalism and Utopias, moving to the abolition movement. Now we're moving into something that's going to spur again in American History 2, and that's with the women's movement. Now, this, as we talk about today, is very early on. We're not talking about we're not talking about suffrage yet. We're not talking about the 19th Amendment, which grants women the right to vote yet. That's going to be later on in American history too. What we're talking about today instead is how that's all going to start, how that's all going to bring that question, that debate up in American politics. So with that said, let's go ahead and move forward. So our learning objectives for today are going to be how do we identify and how do we see what were the limits to American women during this time, during the 1800s. We see that with many different religious minorities and with African Americans in particular. How does that translate to women overall? In addition to that, we'll see how the development of the women's movement progresses throughout the early 1800s, and that's going to impact down the line to the late 1800s with the real suffrage movement moving to the movement to advocate for the 19th Amendment. And then we'll also talk about probably the most pivotal event in the women's movement during the early 1800s, and that is the Seneca Falls Convention. Some of the terms that we'll be seeing today, primarily, as we talked about in this unit, there's no dates, there's no political events we're having to discuss. That was all man history back in Unit 4, and we'll go back to it again in Unit 6. But now we're talking about mainly what is socially going on in the United States at this time. So we're going to be looking more at people and movements that span not just within 1 year, but over course of decades. So people we'll be looking at today in particular, Sojourner Truth, Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the Seneca Falls Convention. We'll also be looking at some other women that are going to be playing pivotal roles in that. So with that said, let's go ahead and move on. All right, so as we start off, we're really going to see in American society today, the reform movements are really spurred by both a need for religious revival, but also those religious revivals and movements with the Second Great Awakening spur another question. What are the problems that we are seeing in the United States today, and how can they be addressed? We've already seen this with addressing religious issues, issues with slavery and the movement of abolition, but now what about women? So for women in this case in the early 1800s, this is going to lay the groundwork for a lot of things that will spur later on in the later 1800s and early 1900s with women's suffrage. This is the foundation of it. All right, so legally, what are the rights for women? Well, not that many during the 1800s. So at this time, women in American society are still not allowed to own property. They're not allowed to vote. They're not allowed to hold public office. But that's all the legal stuff. Socially, probably it's not better. Socially, women are discouraged from speaking in public events. If they do, it's going to be like, do you have authority? Who are you to do this to us? So we also see that women were going to be subservient to their husbands. If they weren't married, then they were subservient to their fathers. So it was a system where women were socially seen as the lesser of the genders, and legally they just did not have the same rights as men did. Now today we see that as oblivious, like that should not be the case. Back then it was something that even women sought to change, but not every woman and not every man saw it that way. It was a period of movements and development over time to get us to that point. However, in Europe, this is still the case, but a lot of people in Europe are still like, this is the tradition. It's a patriarchal society. However, in the United States, it's different. We have different culture groups in the United States that kind of clash with the patriarchy, particularly with Native American and Mexican American citizens, because in their culture, particularly Native American culture, there is a idea of matrilineal hierarchy. What I mean by matrilineal is in that custom, usually when a child is born, they are adopted into their mother's line of family or their lineage, their last name, their clan, whatever. So we see women play a huge role, or larger role in the family structure, as well as society in general. So in Native American and Mexican American cultures, it's not uncommon to see women participate in both religious and political events. So when we see these white European Anglo-Americans, it seems like there's a patriarchy versus matrilineal is not mixing. So this is also going to kind of spur that movement for women. Not only that, but as we get into the 1800s, we see a wave of reform movements and a wave of industrialization that's going to drive two things. For the reform movements, through both the Second Great Awakening, through Transcendentalism, and through abolition, women can actually participate in these movements. But as they participate in these movements, they're seeing if we are part of this process, we should be advocating for ourselves as well. Not only that, but in the industrialization side, with the old influx of new industry jobs and factories, it's not just men who are taking these jobs, it's also women as well. Some of the first people to work in the Lao system up in Massachusetts in those first textile mills were women. So if they see that, hey, I'm working in this factory, there's a guy over here, and I'm right here, but I'm receiving less because of me being a woman, then that's going to cause issues in manufacturing jobs. So these two real events, the reform movements and industry jobs, are going to spur women to start to advocate for equality, both legally and socially. All right. So we can see here in a chart right here, you can pause the video, see what were some of those limitations of women that they could not do. So we see this from both a legal and a social standpoint. And not only that, but we also see now that women are starting to change both in society and in fashion. We're seeing a new wave of fashions of instead of the traditional garments that would cover everything, we're seeing women that can change their hairstyles and be part of the new American culture that we see in the Victorian era. All right. So now that we see this, we're going to start to see different movements of women who try to advocate for their rights. And this is not just from the lower classes. This is really going to start from the higher classes, from the middle class, because these are the women who are actually able to go out and advocate for their equality with men if they have the ability to interact with elites, interact with business leaders and politicians, while lower class women who can work are going to advocate at the lower levels. They're going to start to advocate to women who are working alongside them in industry jobs that, hey, we have rights just as men do in these industry jobs. So moving on to this one, for the women's movement in general, it really starts just like the abolition movement. It started way before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but it gained, just like in the abolition movement, it gained momentum with the spur of the abolition movement in the 1800s. This is when the 1800s when this is going to gain momentum for both the abolition movement and the women's movement. As a matter of fact, those two movements were often seen as equal and as working for the same thing. Many women in these movements often advocated that if enslaved peoples in the South had no rights, and yet in our households and whatever we're subservient to our fathers, we are no better than people who are enslaved down the South. So these movements often were seen as equal in both just cause and for what they were fighting for. So obviously there will be disagreements with this. Most women in American society probably were not part of these movements in general. This was mainly still a minority group of people women who advocated for equality, and that's going to grow as we go from the early 1800s to the mid 1800s, all the way to the late 1800s when it becomes a rallying cry for a majority of women in America. So not only that, but this is also going to be supported by, or women's movement is also going to be supported by many men, primarily in northern states. We don't see that much in the southern states because remember, in the southern states, there's still this system in place, this hierarchical system of racial and social classes that had to be in balance, and women were no exception to that. But we see that primarily participation from both men and women in the northern states. All right. But one of these disagreements is going to spur probably the most pivotal event in the women's movement during the early 1800s. That's going to be a moment in 1840 in London. Where two women are going to advocate to come into a business meeting in London and advocate, hey, we should be part of this meeting as well. They're kicked out, and so, hey, you can't be in here. So, what's going to happen? These women are going to go off and 8 years later, and they're going to fund the Seneca Falls Convention in New York. And let's go ahead and talk about that. And guys, I'll let you pause the video right here and just to see what were some of these different opportunities for women in both school um, and jobs during this time, and as it continued to grow throughout the 1800s. One of the things that we often see here is women's involvement in education and penitentiary movements, where we see women primarily dominate the field of education because they're able to go in there and advocate to young students that of their rallying cry for equality of both men and women. All right, now back to Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth C. Stanton. Those were the two women, as I said, in that meeting in London in 1840. These two American women decided to go to it to advocate for women's rights in the workplace and businesses, and they were kicked out. They were said, "Nah, you can't be in there. Let the men kind of discuss your issues for you." So these women don't back down. They come back to the United States kind of pissed off about it, and they'll advocate for their ability to um, create organizations and build um, sentiments for themselves. And that's going to happen in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention in New York. So these two women, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they'll form together with support of not only other women but even African American women as well and other men. Most of the time, their husbands and men that weren't even involved would come up and be part of this convention. The funny thing about Sojourner Truth, she was the only African American woman who wanted to participate. She wasn't. She was declined to come into it, but she still played a big part in the women's movement because she will contribute offline to the sentiments that are going to come out of this Seneca Falls Convention. What happens after this? Um, the delegates are going to come together and create the Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments is modeled right after the Declaration of Independence, stating out these are the rights of the American people, like it was in the Declaration of Independence. Now it's for women. This Declaration of Sentiments is going to go through changes just like the Declaration of Independence did. And even though it won't set any kind of major groundbreaking laws or amendments in the Constitution like we'll see later in American history, it will set a precedent. Remember what a precedent is. It's an event or something that will be set in stone for others to follow. So what's going to be this precedent that's set by the Seneca Falls Convention? For one thing, it ties the movements of both abolition and the women's movement together. One of the delegates of the Seneca Falls Convention was Frederick Douglass. He comes and shows his support for this, as he's shown the same support for the abolition movement. Not only that, some young women in attendance who didn't really participate because they were kind of young girls at the time, but they're going to advocate strongly later on in life. Two of these women, Amelia Bloomer and Susan B. Anthony. You probably heard of her before. Amelia Bloomer, she's very young at the time. She didn't speak in the convention, but later on she'll write in its inspiration of the convention, The Lily, which advocated for the equality of men and women. Susan B. Anthony, she was only 28 at the time she met Elizabeth Stanton there briefly, but she will later on go to move to be a huge leader in the temperance movement and for women's suffrage in the late 1800s, ultimately winning that with the 18th and 19th Amendment. And another thing that's going to pass in the same year, the Seneca Falls Convention, Congress will pass the Married Women's Property Act, which granted women some property rights in relations to are you able to purchase it or are you able to inherit it from your father or husband? Later on, that law will be amended to be more flexible, to allow women to own property and even to ensure that they can inherit property as well. It won't advocate for voting, but that's going to come later in American History 2.